Alright everyone, welcome back to another video. Last time I left off with Monroe and his doctrine, talking about President James Monroe and his little doctrine, and a few other things of course. But we're now on to fresh winds from western forests. One of the main events in the early years of the Republic was the settlement of the region between the Appalachians and the Missouri Valley. Most of this area was still thickly wooded, though in parts of Illinois and increasingly in Iowa and eastern Kansas, there were patches of grassy prairie. Um, the settlement of the open plains to the Rockies and of the Pacific coast had to await a later generation. The center of population at the time of the first census was near Baltimore. By 1860, it was in Ohio, which was regarded as a western state in Jackson's time, a central one in Lincoln's, and an eastern one in McKinley's. One of the first steps was to get rid of the Indians. In part, their lands were bought, in part, they were seized by force. The woods themselves constituted a problem. They furnished timbers for the log cabins, but had to be cleared to permit farming. Sometimes this task was overdone. In parts of Michigan, for example, forests were cut down where the land was not suitable for agriculture, but most of the clearing was necessary. As one Ohio pioneer put it, none but those who had held the first plow amid roots, stumps, stones, and trees, while the faithful team was pulling and jerking it along, can really enjoy the delight that the same plowman feels while holding the plow as it moves along without a root or stump to obstruct it. In the Southwest, there were greater difficulties in Ohio. Settlers often moved out as individuals, and so were more open to Indian attacks than were whole communities were settled. Kentucky was sometimes called the Dark and Bloody Ground because of the frequent Indian wars. In many parts of Europe, the rural population lived in village communities and walked to the plowed fields. Not so in Western America. There each homestead stood in the midst of its own lands, often miles away from the nearest neighbor. Rural isolation was one of the hardships of the pioneer. This was doubly hard on the women, who did not have the male privilege of hunting, fishing, and frequently riding to market. If pioneer life was selected by a particularly hardy type of men, this even more true of the women. Since the men predominated, women acquired scarcity value and were honored accordingly. Coeducation, equal property laws, women's suffrage all began in the West. Oh wait, I just completely. Uh, by necessity, most houses were made by their owners, and most clothing was woven of homespun. For the housekeeping, let us cite another Ohio witness. We used to bake Indian pone, that is, bread made of rye and cornmeal. Our folks were too kind. They weren't much good for holding some things, but if we used our knives for conveying food to our mouths, it had to be done with the back of the knife to the face. Our starch was of two kinds, either made from the flour or from grated potato. If one wants a light now, all one has to do is pull a string or press a button. Then we had to pick up a coal with tongs, hold it against a candle, and blow. And one had to make the candles. The influence of the West was in many ways salutary. For nearly a century, the Northwest represented a society in which the common man had come into his own, and the only social distinction went to the pioneer, who wielded the best axe or could shoot the straightest. But not all the influence of the West was good. There was much land grabbing and land gambling because of a restless spirit that forever sought greener pastures. The pioneer's versatility led to a scorn of the expert. Charles Dickens and other European observers pointed out a marked deterioration in frontier manners. What saved the West from degrading into a land of hard swearing, hard drinking illiterates was the presence of the school and the church. To be sure, both were at first rather elementary. In the one room log cabin school, a young man, or perhaps a young woman, taught a dozen rowdy children with a spelling book and a birch rod, and the itinerant um, whole minister's whole library consisted of his Bible. But as each new settlement was planted, a public school was built as a matter of course, and the churchers gave a touch of color to the drab lives of the pioneer women. Yeah, we really can't think about the pioneer lives. They are very unique in a sense of all of human history, really. For a lot of human history, people moved as groups, and yeah, you would have your hermits that moved way out into just open fields for long, long periods. But for a lot of history, the big settlements dominated. The world had kind of been grabbed up by this point. The only really time you could really consider it with is like the Neolithic or the Bronze Age or things like that. The really early ages of human life. But by the later ages, the Iron Age, maybe a little later than that even, a lot of the Europe or Asia or many other lands had been truly and well and truly conquered by man in many ways. Yeah, they were still not fully, but you know what I mean. The general feel of it. But the Western movement of the United States is very unique in that you have these people who have experienced all this and then move out. Well, they'll never see a person again. Some people will never see another person for many years. All the people that they knew, they'll never see again, and it's very unique just in that regard. Um, really would be weird, moving out there and you're by yourself and maybe you'll see another person. Who knows when? Or you have to worry about the Native Americans attacking just randomly, you never know when it could happen. And you're the one that has to make all of the everything basically for you. It's very, very odd. It would be a very weird feeling. Now let's get into the picture. Above, it was a period of emigration to the west. In this faithful scene, a well-fed, well-scrubbed family pauses on its journey to eat a meal of either game birds or deer. Yeah, the Oregon Trail. Have a lot of families moving out west. Um, how they would feed themselves is they would either get game along the way, so bird or deer was quite common. Sometimes something else maybe. They would also bring herds of animals with them, so sheep, cow, um, sometimes other things, but sheep and cow were typical. Clothing and dairy. Those are pretty typical. Um, Sometimes they would bring these big herds and then they just let a bunch of them go to just go out. And basically, the idea was, hey, if you let them go out and find their own way, then when other people come by, or maybe you come by later, there'll be big herds that you can just grab from then, and then you're all good. This happened quite a lot, actually. It happened with the original colonization of the Americas, where horses, for instance, were not native, And so the Spaniards would brought over a bunch of horses and just released them into the you know North and South America. They just let them go, and well, horses take off then. Below, in another idyllic view of pioneering homestead, the father has just brought home a deer for supper, while the others are clearing a forest in hopes of planting their crop. And you can see right here many of the trees being cut down in different stages of being cut down. Got the log cabin being built, or a log structure of some sort. Father brings home the food. There's the deer. And yeah, they were clearing for planting crop. It's a very idealized version of things, but you're gonna have those once in a while. And then here, just making sure this is the right one. Yes, okay, just making sure. So the right, probably the first Western American hero, was Daniel Boone. In this scene, he is shown protecting his family from a rampaging Indian. Boone once said that he had been ordained by God to settle the wilderness, and with 30 men had cut a road from the back country of North Carolina to the bluegrass region of Kentucky. Yeah, Daniel Boone, obviously very well-known figure in American folklore. A lot of his stories, maybe a little bit of myth, but um, that's what you're gonna get with a lot of people. You're gonna have a lot of myth, not as much fact. But Daniel Boone, definitely very interesting guy. People would bring him up much later, quite often. Uh, Interesting feller, to say the least. And then below is a frontier schoolroom. And you can see teaching there. It looks like another teacher there, actually. Not this many teachers usually. Usually only one. But yeah, you'd have the one-room schoolhouse. Very, very common. Even before that, you'd have smaller buildings than we would think of, like one-room schoolhouse even. But yeah, those are very common, obviously for the time. There's not a lot of people, so you don't need as many students. And as people's population grows, of course, schools will get bigger, or you'll just add more. It really depends. But typically, they just get bigger to a degree. But that's going to do it for this video. If you guys liked the video, leave a like. If you have any ways I can improve these videos, leave a comment down below. I just appreciate your feedback. And as always, subscribe. It really does help out the channel. Thank you.